Okay, thank you very much for having me. My name is Nicholas Tito. I'm a research fellow at the Eindhoven University of Technology. I want to thank the organizers for having me today to talk about this story. And I'm actually happy to follow the previous two speakers because this story will kind of incorporate elements from both of their talks on how we can exploit entropy in the form of simple thermal molecular motion to enhance the toughness of polymer gels. Okay? So I always like to start with this slide because I think I'm a chemist by training, and when I was a chemistry student, the mantra, so to speak, was that entropy causes disorder in molecular systems. And I think perhaps all of us in the room have seen examples of where that's not always the case. And so I want to actually highlight this story in particular as being one where entropy is leading to more possibilities. And it drives systems into having more molecular possibilities. And I also think it's nice because you'll see that this is actually a story where entropy can lead to more functional possibilities of material as well. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to think about how we can design entropy in materials to make more interesting functionality. So the story today is about reversibly cross-linked polymer gels. And so I don't have a gel here, so we're going to do a fictitious one. This is my gel. And the goal I have is that I want to take a gel, and if I pull the gel or deform it in some way, it has an elastic response, which is designed by the chemistry of the gel. And if I pull it, eventually it'll fail. It'll fracture or something terrible will happen to it. And that's obviously a bad thing to happen. And so I want to talk about ways that we can make it tougher, which means that we basically can make it be pulled more before it breaks. But I want to make it tougher while also maintaining the same elasticity of the material, because oftentimes there's a trade-off between toughness and elasticity. Okay? So I want it to be very flexible, but very tough, so that I can pull it a very long way before it breaks. Right. And I should say, if anyone wants any additional details, this is in a paper that was just recently published about a month ago. So I want to start with the experimental system. Actually, I'm a theorist, so I'll do my best to crash through a little bit of the chemistry of how this system is made. So the system is actually one among several that have been made. Is it's a polymer gel of permanently cross-linked poly-4-vinyl pyridine monomers. That's the blue lines up there. The permanent cross-links are just little hexyl chains, so those are sort of embedded in the network. And then we throw into the solution phase of the gel reversible cross-links. And there are these things right here. They're called Van Coten complexes. And they are basically characterized by these transition metals that can form up to 2 bonds with the poly-4-vinyl pyridine monomers, nitrogen on the poly-4-vinyl pyridine. And you can tune the binding strength of these Van Coten complexes by changing the organic scaffold that surrounds them. Okay? So the important thing is that these bonds are reversible because they're transition metal bonds. Okay? And that will be important for the functionality of these systems. And so what's observed in experiment is a very interesting behavior that if I actually design my reversible cross-linking complexes appropriately, I end up with this kind of stress-strain behavior. So for those of you who are not mechanics people, this is just a plot of the restoring force I feel on the polymer gel as a function as I pull it apart, the strain. Okay? And so the gray curve, which is a bit hard to see down here, is the plain polymer gel. It's with no reversible cross-links. If I add reversible cross-links into the material, I get the light blue and the dark blue curves. And so what I find is actually that the material has a very similar modulus or slope or characteristic curvature to this stress-strain plot, but I'm actually allowing it to be strained more before it breaks. And the breakage point is where this plot just falls off and crashes. Okay? So somehow these reversible cross-links are doing something to the mechanics of the network that allow this behavior. And this is very interesting from a theoretical perspective. Okay. That was for one choice of reversible cross-links. You can choose other structures for these reversible linkers. And in particular, if I increase the binding strength, I get quite a different behavior. I get this behavior shown here. So again, here's the intrinsic material shown here. And as I add more of these strong binding reversible linkers, I actually end up changing the modulus. So the slope of the stress-strain curve gets steeper. It's a stiffer material. And it becomes more brittle because actually it fails at a lower strain. Okay? So that's not desired. That's exactly what we don't want. We do want the one on the left-hand side. So we want to think about what are the physics microscopically that are happening to lead that behavior to be true. Okay? And how do we optimize it? So in beginning this project, there were a lot of false starts, actually. I'm not so happy to say that, but the one that actually did yield some success was to think really fundamentally about what governs the stress-strain behavior of a network. And among other properties, one of those is the topology of the network. So at the microscale, a polymer network has some connectivity where chains are attached to other chains by permanent crosslinks. And so if I alter the length of those chains, the number of monomers of those chains, or if I alter the number of crosslinks or the way those chains are connected, I will alter the force response of the network. That's a fundamental property of a polymer network. Okay? And that actually led to some interesting insight. If I make any change to the topology, I necessarily change the force response. And so if we now think about taking a permanent network and we want to add reversible crosslinks, but we don't want to change the force response, we can't really do this, because if I just randomly distribute the reversible crosslinks across the network topology, then that will actually change the topology and it'll make it stiffer. Okay? And so we would expect that this is probably not what's happening. And so this might be the naive sort of entropically enthusiastic approach where the things are randomized. Right? And so after some thought, you arrive at another possibility, which is that what if the reversible crosslinks somehow are biased to form bonds near the existing permanent crosslinks? Okay? If they do that, then what I'm doing is I'm mechanically reinforcing the permanent crosslinks at the local level, and I'm also not changing the connectivity of the network overall. It's the same overall topology. The question is, why would they do this from thermodynamics, and what are the repercussions of this? So the reason for this is actually the title of the story. It's entropy. So we can kind of take a very intuitive example. Let's say that my body is a permanent crosslink and I have two polymer chains here. My arms would be attached to other crosslinks, presumably in the system. If I try to form a bond between my elbows, let's say, right, so close to the permanent crosslink, then I can still move my arms around. There's still a lot of translational flexibility of the polymer chains in that case. Okay? So the entropic cost for that bond is very low from the perspective of the polymer chains. Okay? So I don't lose much entropy. If I make that bond further away from the permanent crosslink, now I cost quite a bit more entropy. Okay? And so indeed, there's this built-in equilibrium thermodynamic bias for the reversible crosslinks to cluster near the permanent crosslinks just by entropy. Okay? And so how big is this effect? You can quantify it through a few different ways. The easiest one to start with is the Gaussian polymer chain model. So you just treat these polymers as two Gaussian polymers extending from a point in space. And you can back out this equation, and this is just a back-of-the-envelope calculation. It's actually the cost of the entropy for forming a loop between the two polymers, as shown going, oh, this laser doesn't work, as going from the top to the bottom picture. And this effect is not enormous in this case, because it depends logarithmically on the contour length of the loop size, okay? So I have to go actually quite far out to get a significant entropy penalty. So it's there, but it's not enormous in this case. Okay. But it is more significant if I look at the case of stretched polymers, or polymers that have their endpoints fixed. And that's actually more realistic for the case that would be happening in a polymer network, where the chains are not floppy, they're actually in a gel as I strain it. Now the chains are being stretched, and they're also attached to other neighbors. And so if I try to make, for example, here in this cartoon, I look at the entropy cost for forming a bond between two polymers that are a 90-degree angle to each other, with their endpoints constrained to some distance. Okay? And I vary the stretch length of the polymers between these different percentage values, 10% free polymer, 10%, and 37.5%. And you can see as I make the polymers more stretched at this fixed angle, actually the entropy cost gets really large. So you can see in the case of the 25% stretched chain, it's not very stretched as a polymer, but already if I make a loop that's of size 100 monomers, I'm getting an entropy cost of around 10 kT, which is actually quite large in terms of molecular properties. Okay? So in polymer networks, we can expect there's quite a strong driving force for this entropic clustering. Okay? So we wanted to think and to see if this happens in a more realistic system. So we just took another simple situation, but now in molecular dynamics simulation. We took these two polymer chains, the red and the blue. We permanently cross-link them by the brown bead and just fix that to the origin of the system. And then we put in reversible crosslinks, which is the purple things. And those can diffuse through the system. And they have, it's a bit hard to see, but they have little green binding eyeballs. And so they can form two bonds, and they form bonds with the little orange eyeballs on the polymer chains. Okay? So each monomer can hold one bond, and each reversible crosslink can make two bonds. It's valence limited. So what we do is we look at the probability that a reversible crosslink makes a bond as a function of the distance from the permanent crosslink. Okay? And so in this plot here, that's the monomer index. So index 50 is the position where I put the permanent crosslink on the two chains. And then position 100 and 0 are the two endpoints of the polymers. And I'm averaging just the chance that I see a bond over the simulation in that system. And these are for somewhat low binding strengths, low binding enthalpies. And so the green is very weak, the red is a bit more moderate, and you actually see a very clear clustering, that there's a preponderance, quite a substantial enhancement of probability of finding a bond quite close to the permanent crosslink. These are for free polymers, and they have excluded volume and everything like that. Okay. If I go to stronger binding linkers, then I start to lose this effect. Okay? And so that's actually quite intuitive, because if I am a reversible crosslink, it's not just the entropy that controls where I go, it's actually the binding free energy, and that incorporates the enthalpy of binding as well. So if I have a strong binding enthalpy, I can pay a higher cost to make a bond, and so I can pay a higher entropy cost to make a bond further from a permanent crosslink. So there's a sweet spot where I can tune the binding enthalpy so that it's weak enough that I'm predisposed to form near the permanent crosslink, but it's not so weak that I don't form at all. Okay? And that would seem to be in this red data set right there. Okay. So I don't have time to talk about this stuff, but we're doing some more detailed simulations where we take a really big three-dimensional full polymer network with reversible crosslinks. We put them into a box and we do a strain test, and we actually look at the spatial correlations of the permanent and reversible crosslinks. And we actually do find that there is some interesting behavior that it seems to be evidencing that there's clustering of the reversible crosslinks, and I have plots if anyone wants to see them afterwards. So I touched upon this, but how do we optimize this recruitment effect? It's really about the binding free energy. And so we want to design reversible crosslinks that can pay the cost for binding just near a permanent crosslink, but not farther away. Okay? That will give us this weak binding free energy regime, and that will hopefully lead to the topology of the network being maintained, and then we end up with this interesting stress strain behavior where we enhance the toughness of it. If these things are too strong binding, then I can bind promiscuously across the whole network because I can pay any entropy cost in principle. And now I alter the topology of the network, and so I'm going to change my stress strain curve, which is not desirable. So that's the optimum. And I'll actually talk at the end just about a couple of experimental design properties for that. So the last part of the story is how do these things help? Once we've recruited them around a permanent crosslink, they share load. That's what they do. And so if I have just my permanent crosslink and I pull at that region of the network, that has to bear all the load, and so the failure chance is going to be higher as I get to a higher extension force. If I have one or two helpers nearby, they can load share. And that's sort of the principle that if you've recruited these things, they can load share. But the story is a bit more complex because now we have to think about the kinetics of this, because if the linkers are very weak binding, they might recruit, but they might not stay long enough to actually bear any load that's usable for the material. And so we can draw this rough schematic where we look at the strain rate of the material on the vertical axis and the bond swapping rate on the horizontal axis, and we can divide it into two regimes. Over here, if the swapping rate is very fast, but the strain rate is very slow, you can kind of call that the equilibrated regime, and that's where actually we're straining very slowly, and so the reversible links are moving around very quickly. And so the responsive material will be quite dictated by the equilibrium ensemble, which is this clustered ensemble of reversible crosslinks. If I'm on the other side, I'm in what you might call a trapped regime, and this is where I strain so quickly, and the bonds are rearranging slowly relatively to that stray linkers that are away from the equilibrium ensemble might dictate more strongly the mechanical behavior. Okay? And so I don't have the time scale provided to those things to let them rearrange and to equilibrate into a better position. So we want to be here because this is actually the region where you get the best clustering, but you also don't want to be there at the same time because those bonds might be too weak to actually bear mechanical force. And so I expect, and I don't have proof for this yet, but this is actually the subject of some ongoing work, I suspect there's a sweet spot in there where we've tuned the kinetic lifetime of these bonds so they're long-lived enough to bear mechanical strain on a time scale that's sufficient to make the material tougher, but they're also rearranging fast enough on the strain time scale to effectively cluster around the permanent crosslinks. Okay. So I've mentioned these different optima. So there's this weak binding free energy optimum for the clustering, but there's also this optimum kinetic regime. And so how do we get that in experiment? Because they seem a bit contradictory, perhaps. And so those of you who are not chemists, there's really one design or two design parameters that are most important for tuning the overall binding free energy of the linkers. and this is what's called the equilibrium constant, this KEQ. And this is just, it's the exponential of the binding free energy, actually. So we can tune KEQ, and that's actually just the chemical construction of these linkers. So we can tune the atoms that we use. That determines our KEQ. But we can also get into a weak binding free energy regime given a KEQ by tuning the concentration of the linkers. Because it's the product of those two that actually leads to the effective binding free energy that we see in this system. So we can tune that. That gets us to a weak binding free energy regime effectively. And the nice thing is that we can actually then independently tune the kinetics. Okay? So we can get into a weak binding free energy regime, but then we can tune the rate at which we bind and unbind reversible crosslinkers by tuning the K on and K off, the rate constants. Okay? And it's nice because actually it's the ratio of those rate constants that determines the KEQ times the concentration. So I can actually scale K on and K off by any factor I want to, large or small, and still be in the same KEQ regime, the weak binding regime, but I can actually arbitrarily shift my time scale that the exchange happens at the same time. And the way you do that is by activation barriers. So when you have a binding event or an unbinding event, you can assume a very low activation barrier, in which case it's governed by the free energy change of binding. But you can also add a big hump in that reaction coordinate, and that hump actually has to be surmounted every time a bond forms or breaks. And that is how you tune your time scale. Okay? So I think this is the way that you can get into the optimal regime of the system where you get clustering, because it's a weak binding free energy regime, but you can get long time scales of bonds that can bear mechanical stress. Sorry. Okay, so that was the story. And just to summarize, so this was a story about how entropy actually drives reversible crosslinks to recruit around permanent crosslinks. And paradoxically, perhaps, it's a situation where entropy leads the linkers to exhibit some visible form of order. They're not disordered, actually. But it actually leads the polymers to have the most possibility at the molecular scale, and that's why they're doing that. The recruitment effect is maximized when you're in this weak binding free energy regime. And once these linkers recruit, then they share load at the local scale, and that's what leads the material to be tougher on a global scale. Okay. With that, I want to thank my group, Theory of Polymers and Soft Matter. It's at TUE, and the Institute for Complex Molecular Systems. This work was actually funded by this, it's called 4TU High Tech Materials grant in the Netherlands. And I want to thank all of you for your attention.
Well, how does it work experimentally? Like, is it easy? Does it work this way?
It does, yeah. Well, I mean, so we don't have any like evidence for spatial clustering of these things in experiment yet. We just have the measurements, so the stress strain measurements that I showed. But there's some other evidence that I didn't have time to show from actually Constantino Creton's group in ESPCI, where they keep the same chemical construction of the reversible crosslinks, but they vary the strain rate. And they find actually that when they strain very, very slowly, that is the regime where they see the most toughness enhancement with the smallest change in the elasticity, which would imply that you're in this quasi-equilibrium regime, and so you're letting the things equilibrate and cluster. If you strain faster, then your modulus gets stiffer.
What about all these composite systems that experimentalists make and
Yeah.
more complicated and stuff? Can you add on to this?
Yeah, I think so. So this argument works really well when you have a dilute polymer network. If it's more concentrated, then it becomes difficult because you have entanglements that might govern things. And I think that'll complicate the entropy, because now the entropy is a bit more non-trivial. So this works really well for dilute gels. But yeah, you can complicate it with different kinds of linkers and stuff like that. We thought about multiple linkers with multiple lifetimes, so 2 species or 3 species. It's not obvious what effect that would have yet, but you can think of those games as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Does this have any relation to vitrimers?
Vitrimers are similar, yeah. So the vitrimers, the bond exchange events are activated thermally. This one's a bit different because the vitrimers usually, you might imagine like star polymers where they have these binding events at their the arm tips. So you maybe would have to change the entropy argument a little bit, because here it's really a permanent network that's in place, and you're looking at the entropic bias to form reversible crosslinks by little monomers, basically. So it's a different perspective, but there is some overlap, yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank
Thanks a
you
lot.
very much, Nick. Thanks to the speakers.
Thank you.